Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Against Our Better Judgment, the hidden history of how the U.S. was used to create Israel by Alison Weir. I've actually done a much longer and detailed version of this review. I'll put a link to it with a card and in the description as well. But today I'm going to do a much shorter, you could say, express review. I'm going to be focusing on 4 key takeaways from the book. The first is that Israel could not have been created, nor can it be maintained to this day without great power support. At first, this was Britain, and now it's the United States. The second is that Nazis and Zionists collaborated in order to bring Jews to Palestine. The third is that many U.S. officials opposed the creation of a Jewish state, which would become known as Israel. And fourthly, Zionists forced unwilling Jews, Jews who did not have any desire to come to Palestine, they forced them to go, they coerced them to go, and many people don't know a lot of these facts. So, as I say, this will be a much shorter version of the review. If you're interested in going deeper into some of these issues, either pick up the book, obviously, or check out my longer review that I've alluded to. From the very beginning of their movement, Zionists realized that if they were to succeed in their goal of creating a Jewish state on land that was already inhabited by non-Jews, they needed backing from one of the great powers. They tried the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine at that time, but were turned down. And I also allude to this in a review I did on the Jewish state by Theodore Herzl. I'll put a link to that both in the description and with a card. So they were turned down by the Ottoman Empire, although they were told that Jews could settle throughout other parts of the Ottoman Empire and become Turkish citizens. They then turned to Britain, which was also initially less than enthusiastic. Famous English Middle East experts such as Gertrude Bell pointed out that Palestine was Arab and that Jerusalem was sacred to all 3 major monotheistic faiths. Future British Foreign Minister Lord George Curzon similarly stated that Palestine was already inhabited by 500,000 Arabs who would not be content either to be expropriated for Jewish immigrants or to act merely as hewers of wood and drawers of water for the latter. However, once the British were embroiled in World War I, and particularly during 1916, a disastrous year for the Allies in which there were 60,000 British casualties in one day alone, Zionists were able to play a winning card. While they previously had appealed to religious or idealistic arguments, now Zionist leaders could add a particularly powerful motivator, telling the British government that Zionists in the U.S. would push America to enter the war on the side of the British if the British promised to support a Jewish home in Palestine afterward. In 1917, British Foreign Minister Lord Balfour issued a letter to Zionist leader Lord Rothschild. Known as the Balfour Declaration, this letter promised that Britain would view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. The letter then qualified this somewhat by stating that it should be clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The non-Jewish communities were 92% of Palestine's population at the time, vigorous Zionist immigration efforts having slightly expanded the percentage of Jews living in Palestine by then. The letter, while officially signed by British Foreign Minister Lord Balfour, had been in process for 2 years and had gone through a number of edits by British and American Zionists and British officials. As Zionist leader Nahum Sokolow later wrote, "Every idea born in London was tested by the Zionist organization in America, and every suggestion in America received the most careful attention in London." So, we talked about the fact that there was another mechanism activating the Balfour Declaration, and this was a backdoor movement to get the United States involved in World War I. Samuel Landman, secretary of the World Zionist Organization, described them in detail in a 1936 article in World Jewry. He explained that a secret gentleman's agreement had been made in 1916 between the British government and Zionist leaders. So it's not some conspiracy theory by some goyim. This is a Jew writing in World Jewry, a Zionist, effectively bragging about what happened. After an understanding had been arrived at between Sir Mark Sykes and Zionists Wiseman and Sokolow, it was resolved to send a secret message to Justice Brandeis that the British cabinet would help the Jews to gain Palestine in return for active Jewish sympathy and for support in the USA for the Allied cause, so as to bring about a radical, pro-Allied tendency in the United States. Landman wrote that once the British had agreed to help the Zionists, this information was communicated to the press, which he reported rapidly began to favor the U.S. joining the war on the side of Britain. Landman claimed that Zionists had fulfilled their side of the contract and that it was Jewish help that brought USA into the war on the side of the Allies, thus causing the defeat of Germany. He went on to state that this had rankled in Germany ever since and contributed in no small measure to the prominence which anti-Semitism occupies in the Nazi program. British Colonial Secretary Lord Cavendish also wrote about this agreement and its result in a 1923 memorandum to the British Cabinet stating, "The object of the Balfour Declaration was to enlist the sympathies on the Allied side of influential Jews and Jewish organizations all over the world, and it is arguable that the negotiations with the Zionists did in fact have considerable effect in advancing the date at which the United States government intervened in the war." Former British Prime Minister Lloyd George similarly referred to the deal, telling a British commission in 1935, "Zionist leaders gave us a definite promise that, if the Allies committed themselves to giving facilities for the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, they would do their best to rally Jewish sentiment and support throughout the world to the Allied cause. They kept their word." Brandeis University professor and author Frank E. Manuel reported that Lloyd George had testified in 1937 that stimulating the war effort of American Jews was one of the major motives which, during a harrowing period in the European war, actuated members of the cabinet in finally casting their votes for the declaration. American career Foreign Service officer Evan M. Wilson, who had served as Minister Consul General in Jerusalem, also described this arrangement in his book Decision on Palestine. He wrote that the Balfour Declaration was given to the Jews largely for the purpose of enlisting Jewish support in the war and of forestalling a similar promise by the Central Powers. And remember, I talked about this in my more lengthy review. They also made sure to scuttle a separate peace deal the Ottoman Empire was trying to effect at that time. So the Ottomans were tired of the war, 1916-17. They were going for peace, a separate peace. But the Jews, the Zionists, couldn't allow this to happen because the Ottomans had already said no. So if the Ottomans make peace, Palestine's not up for grabs, and so the project dies. So they had to scuttle that peace deal and make sure that the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The official biographer of Lloyd George, author Malcolm Thompson, stated that the determining factor in the decision to issue the Balfour Declaration was the scheme for engaging by some such concession the support of American Zionists for the Allied cause in the First World War. Similarly, Zionist historian Naomi Cohen calls the Balfour Declaration a wartime measure and writes, "Its immediate object was to capture Jewish sympathy, especially in the United States, for the Allies, and to shore up England's strategic interests in the Near East. The declaration was pushed," she writes, "by leading Zionists in England and by Brandeis, who intervened with President Wilson." Finally, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, wrote in 1939, "To a certain extent, America had played a decisive role in the First World War, and American Jewry had a considerable part, knowingly or not, in the achievement of the Balfour Declaration." So plans within plans, wheels within wheels. No one ever said that the Zionists were not cunning. No one ever said that the Zionists didn't execute their plans well, remarkably well, and they have to be given credit for that, as much as it galls me. So that's point number one. Israel could not come into existence without a great power sponsor, and it cannot be maintained without a great power sponsor. Originally that was Britain, later on it became the United States, today it still is the United States. Israel could not continue what it's doing, its genocide, without the assistance of the United States. The United States is complicit in the genocide of today and the genocide of the last 30, 40, 50 years. There was even a certain, so point two, there's collusion between Nazis and Zionists. There was even a certain amount of collusion between Zionists and Nazi leaders. When disturbing facts emerged in the 1950s about this, these caused considerable scandal in Israel and led to the fall of the Israeli government of the time. A number of books are dedicated to the subject, and it is discussed in numerous others. In some cases, there were accusations that Zionist collaboration with Nazis had saved people with connections at the expense of those with none. And Norm Finkelstein talks about this, and this happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. There were many people dying, starving in the Warsaw Ghetto, but there were 13 men at the end of the street who hung out at this particular cafe, and they were the smugglers and the collaborators. So there are always collaborators. And this isn't just for Zionists, not just for the Jews. I mean, there's always collaborators in any society. In some cases, there were accusations that Zionist collaboration with Nazis had saved people with connections at the expense of those with none. The topic inspired novels by well-known Israeli writers Amos Elon and Neil Gordon, was the subject of a 1987 British play, and was portrayed in a 1994 Israeli docudrama. Some Zionist leaders worked out what became known as the Transfer Agreement, a 1933 pact with the Nazis in which Jews who wished to go to Palestine could transfer their capital to Palestine. As part of this agreement, these Zionists agreed to reject a boycott that had been implemented against Germany. Critics were outraged at their undermining of the boycott, a fellow Zionist calling them Hitler's allies. According to author Edwin Black, the great irony is that Adolf Hitler became the chief economic sponsor of Israel. Israeli author Tom Segev explains the agreement was based on the complementary interests of the German government and the Zionist movement. The Nazis wanted the Jews out of Germany, the Zionists wanted them to come to Palestine. For a time, the Nazis worked with the Zionist leaders to promote Jewish emigration to Palestine. A series in a Berlin paper published by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was entitled A Nazi Visits Palestine and depicted glowing photographs of Jewish immigrants in Palestine. Goebbels created a medal with a swastika on one side and the Star of David on the other. Go look it up. You can look it up on Google, see it yourself. There is such a coin, and the 1933 Havara Agreement is what you want to be looking for. Third point, U.S. officials opposed the creation of Israel. And what would happen is Israel would make sure these people got removed, got labeled anti-Semitic, and gradually rid the U.S. State Department of any Arabists, anybody who had any sympathy for what was going on to the Palestinians, until they had people who approved the Zionist program. U.S. State Department opposed the 1947 UN partition plan strenuously, considering Zionism contrary to both fundamental American principles and U.S. interests. For example, the director of the State Department's Office of Near Eastern and African Affairs consistently recommended against supporting a Jewish state in Palestine. The director, named Loy Henderson, warned that the creation of such a state would go against locals' wishes, imperil U.S. interests, and violate democratic principles. Henderson emphasized that the U.S. would lose moral standing in the world if it supported Zionism. At the present time, the United States has a moral prestige in the Near and Middle East unequaled by that of any other great power. We would lose that prestige and would be likely for many years to be considered as a betrayer of the high principles which we ourselves have enunciated during the period of the Second World War. When Zionists pushed the partition plan in the UN, Henderson recommended strongly against supporting their proposal, saying that such a partition would have to be implemented by force and was not based on any principle. He warned that partition would guarantee that the Palestine problem would be permanent and still more complicated in the future. I mean, how prophetic were those words? Henderson elaborated further on how plans to partition Palestine would violate American and UN principles. Proposals for partition are in definite contravention to various principles laid down in the UN Charter as well as to principles on which American concepts of government are based. These proposals, for instance, ignore such principles as self-determination and majority rule. They recognize the principle of a theocratic racial state and even go so far in several instances as to discriminate on grounds of religion and race. Zionists attacked Henderson virulently, calling him anti-Semitic, demanding his resignation, and threatening his family. They pressured the State Department to transfer him elsewhere. One analyst describes this as the historic game of musical chairs, in which officials who recommended Middle East policies consistent with the nation's interests were moved on. In 1948, Truman sent Henderson to the slopes of the Himalayas as ambassador to Nepal. But Henderson was far from alone in making his recommendations. He wrote that his views were not only those of the entire Near East Division, but were shared by nearly every member of the Foreign Service or of the State Department who has worked to any appreciable extent on Near Eastern problems. He wasn't exaggerating. Official after official and agency after agency opposed Zionism. In 1947, the CIA reported that Zionist leadership was pursuing objectives that would endanger both Jews and the strategic interests of the Western powers in the Near and Middle East. Ambassador Henry F. Grady, who has been called America's top diplomatic soldier for a critical period of the Cold War, headed a 1946 commission aimed at coming up with a solution for Palestine. Grady later wrote about the Zionist lobby and its damaging effect on U.S. national interests. I have had a good deal of experience with lobbies, but this group started where those of my experience had ended, wrote Grady. I have headed a number of government missions, but in no other have I ever experienced so much disloyalty. In the United States, since there is no political force to counterbalance Zionism, its campaigns are apt to be decisive. If you'd like to see my review on the Israel lobby, I'll put a link to it in the description as well as a card. Grady concluded that without Zionist pressure, the U.S. would not have had the ill will with the Arab states, which are of such strategic importance in our Cold War with the Soviets. Former Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson also opposed Zionism. Acheson's biographer writes that Acheson worried that the West would pay a high price for Israel. Another author, John Mulhall, records Acheson's warning of the danger for U.S. interests. To transform Palestine into a Jewish state capable of receiving 1 million or more immigrants would vastly exacerbate the political problem and imperil not only American, but all Western interests in the Near East. Why is there problems in the Middle East to this day? Not to say that Arab nations didn't have problems with each other, but we know that there is one nation which has problems with everybody. The Joint Chiefs of Staff reported in late 1947, a decision to partition Palestine, if the decision were supported by the United States, would prejudice United States strategic interests in the Near and Middle East to the point that United States influence in the area would be curtailed to that which could be maintained by military force. The Joint Chiefs issued at least 16 papers on the Palestine issue following World War II. They were particularly concerned that the Zionist goal was to involve the U.S. One 1948 paper predicted that the Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. The CIA stated that Zionist leadership was pursuing objectives that would endanger both Jews and the strategic interests of the Western powers in the Near and Middle East. The head of the State Department's Division of Near Eastern Affairs, Gordon P. Merriam, warned against the partition plan on moral grounds. U.S. support for partition of Palestine as a solution to that problem can be justified only on the basis of Arab and Jewish consent. Otherwise, we should violate the principle of self-determination, which has been written into the Atlantic Charter, the Declaration of the United Nations, and the United Nations Charter, a principle that is deeply embedded in our foreign policy. Even a United Nations determination in favor of partition would be, in the absence of such consent, a stultification and violation of the UN's own charter. Once again, a reminder that the 1947 UN partition has neither moral nor legal force. And finally, something that is not well known at all, and something that I had heard in other places but was well documented in this book. There are plenty, so to this day, many Jews do not live in what is known as Israel, and that's for various reasons. Many left after October 7th, many have left since then, but not every Jew wants to live in Israel, and this flies in the face of the Zionist narrative that the Jews had carried, Israel in their hearts for 2,000 years, and they were just waiting to come back. If that were true, then they would have all moved back, but that's certainly not true. Well, if they won't come back willingly, we will force them back. Zionist cadres infiltrated displaced persons camps that had been set up to house refugees displaced during World War II. These infiltrators tried secretly to funnel people to Palestine. When it turned out that most didn't want to go to Palestine, they worked to convince them, sometimes by force. The fact was that Zionists needed more people to go to Palestine. As Ben-Gurion stated in 1944, the essence of Zionism is one of a populating endeavor to populate Israel with multitudes of Jews. And Ben-Gurion has said on another occasion that if you were an Israeli woman and you had not had at least 4 children, that you were not a loyal patriot of Israel. Israeli professor Yosef Grodzinski explains that Zionists were looking for shomer inoshitov, good human materials, a phrase Zionist organizers frequently used. That's why if you were disabled or if you didn't have any money, you were refused immigration to Palestine. So it wasn't for all Jews. Let's be clear. It was the Jews that the Zionists wanted. They'll trot out religion, they'll trot out Judaism when they want, but it's always been a non-religious project. It's a secular movement, Zionism. Convincing Jews to uproot themselves and move to Palestine proved to be a formidable task. When life is good, people tend to stay where they are. Candidates for Palestine immigration therefore had to be Jews whose life was not good. Post-Holocaust DPs, displaced persons, became a human reserve of great immigration potential, hence a prime target for the Zionists. A senior Mossad commander anticipated that even these might not wish to come to Palestine and would need to be actively recruited. We must not think that thousands upon thousands will come knocking at the country's gates once they open. The Zionist movement must understand that it must be first on the market. When only a minority of Jewish refugees wished to go to Palestine, a report by Zionist operative Rabbi Klausner concluded, the people must be forced to go to Palestine. I mean, you can't make it up. It's right there. It's in black and white. Author Alfred Lilienthal reports that Zionists working in the refugee camps employed numerous means to compel residents to agree to go to Palestine, including confiscation of food rations, dismissal from work, expulsion from the camps, taking away legal protection and visa rights, and in one case, even the public flogging of a recalcitrant recruit for the Israel army. These are people who've been displaced from their homes, survived war, but the Zionists want to make sure that they get their food rations taken away, they're not allowed to work, they don't get visas. You can't make it up. The Jewish Brigade of the British Army, a unit long sought by Zionists and finally created in the final months of the war, was one of the first on the scene. Its soldiers and officers turned into clandestine emissaries of the Zionist movement. Grodzinski reports, one role brigade soldiers took upon themselves was to gather Jewish children hidden away in monasteries or with non-Jewish families, because some monasteries and some non-Jewish families had protected Jews during the war. He writes, Jewish orphans were to be found in many places, having survived thanks to the goodness of Christian families and institutions that hid them throughout the war. Now the brigade soldiers, directed by the Jewish Agency's Diaspora Center, were retrieving them and taking them to special orphanages, where they were to be cared for, receive Zionist education, and be trained for immigration to Palestine. Grodzinski reports that the process was not always easy. Many families who rescued Jewish children were now treating them as if they were their own. To retrieve these children, brigade men occasionally resorted to force. Future Israeli Major General Yossi Peled and his sisters were among them. They had been raised by a Christian family almost from infancy. Brigade soldiers came in one day, armed, and threatened the adoptive parents, saying that these were Jewish children and they must give us away, otherwise they would suffer. They had no choice but to hand us over, and we were put in a Jewish orphanage in Belgium. The children tried to refuse to leave the house, and one of his sisters later said that her brother's screams still echo in her head. One of the best-known orphanages, Salvino House, was run by brigade soldiers who implemented strict rules, including requiring that only Hebrew be spoken. Children were not permitted to leave the orphanage to search for relatives, out of concern that they might then stay in Europe rather than go to Palestine. Grodzinski goes on to report that thousands of children passed through such institutions, their period of residence there being just another part of the journey to the Promised Land. And I've said in the longer review that there was also bombings in Iraq. Iraqi Jews are very integrated into the population. They'd lived there in peace for centuries. They didn't want to come to Palestine, so Mossad had to plant bombs in synagogues, say that the Muslims had planted them, create unrest, and then suddenly there was an exodus of the Iraqi Jews who had never wanted to leave Iraq, who had lived there for centuries and had lived there in peace, just as there are Jews today in Iran living in peace. There have been Jewish populations living in large parts of the Arab world for many centuries. The Jews would like you to think that that wasn't the case, that something happened in 1948 that led to a lot of Jewish expulsions and a lot of problems for Jews in Muslim countries. That is true. But what happened in 1948 that led to that change in attitude? They don't want to make any connections. So, against our better judgment, it's, as I've said before, in my other review, it's actually only 87 pages of text, and then there's 80 something pages or more of endnotes and footnotes. So it's a gathering together of a lot of information, but it's a wonderful bibliography to get you down more rabbit holes. And since doing my first review, I've gone down several of the rabbit holes that she provides, and I'm really, really grateful for it. If you'd like to support this channel, hit like, hit subscribe, share this with somebody who you think might be interested. You can send something via PayPal or buy me a coffee. If you'd like to support the work more regularly, you can do that by becoming a member of Patreon. And a reminder that any proceeds, a portion of any of the proceeds that come from these different channels will go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. They're an organization that helps Palestinian children get medical care that they couldn't otherwise get. You'll also see linked below my Amazon wish list. If you'd like to nominate books for 2025, you can buy them from the list and send them my way, and I will do my best, potentially, to read and review them next year in 2025. If you're also interested in non-Palestinian book reviews, my main channel, Stephen Heiner, is linked in the description, and you'll see pretty much reviews on all kinds of subjects, and sometimes more controversial subjects that you're quote-unquote not allowed to talk about, somewhat similar to what we're not allowed to talk about with Zionism, Palestine, etc. And hope you can join us on that channel as well. Until next time, enjoy your reading.